3401. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Ms. McSally. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Brown, Durbin, Jones, Kane, Leahy, Reed, Schumer, Warner, and Whitehouse. Senators voting in the negative: Cassidy, Cornyn, Kramer, Enzi, Gardner, Grassley, Hawley, Isaacson, Murkowski, Paul, Perdue, Risch, Roberts, Scott of Florida, Shelby, and Thune. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Alexander, no. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Crapo, no. Mrs. Fisher, no. Ms. McSally, no. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mrs. Hyde Smith, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Romney, Mr. Romney, no. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Ms. Stabenow, Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Portman, Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Lee, Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Langford, Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Brasso, Mr. Brasso, no. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, Mr. Toomey, no. Ms. Baldwin, Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mrs. Murray, Mrs. Murray, aye. Ms. Hirono, Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Daines, Mr. Daines, no. Mr. Casey, Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Wyden, Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Kennedy, no. Ms. Hassan, aye. Miss Cinema, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Udall, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Braun, no. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Ms. Smith, Ms. Smith, aye. Ms. Cantwell, Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Coons, Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. McConnell, Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Duckworth, Ms. Duckworth, aye. Ms. Ernst? Ms. Ernst? No. Ms. Cortez Masto? Ms. Cortez Masto? Aye.
Not on this vote, the yeas are 37, the nays are 55. The 60-vote threshold having not been achieved, the bill is not passed. Democratic Leader.
I would ask to address the Senate briefly on leader time.
Senate will be in order. Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. So the bill that was before us has failed. Most of us on this side of the aisle would have much preferred that bill, but that has failed. The bill that Senators Shelby and Leahy have worked on diligently is now before us. I'm going to vote for it. I think most of us on this side are going to vote for it so that we can quickly move to conference. Speaker Pelosi has called the president and suggested a few changes. I think they are 4 changes to this bill. We could quickly have a conference, talk about those 4 changes, try to get them in the bill, and finish this quickly, and I hope that's what will happen. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, I call up my amendment number 901.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Alabama, Mr. Shelby, proposes an amendment numbered 901. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following.
Mr. President, I ask that consent that the reading be waived.
Without objection.
As to yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second?
Mr.
There appears
President.
to be. The yeas and nays are ordered.
Mr. President,
Senator from Kentucky.
I call up my amendment number 902.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Kentucky, Mr. Paul, proposes an amendment numbered 902 to amendment numbered 901. At the appropriate place, insert the following. Section of the unobligated balances for fiscal year 2019, they are hereby rescinded.
I ask consent that the reading be waived.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we are going to spend over $4 billion today, and I just propose that we pay for it. There is a humanitarian crisis at the border, but there's also a debt crisis. We spend hundreds of millions, if not billions, on wasteful projects. Let's take it from foreign aid welfare and spend it on our southern border. We spend hundreds of thousands of dollars subsidizing guinea pig farmers in Peru.
Senate will be in order.
A llama fair in Bolivia, advertisements to buy carbon credits in Mexico. $273 million was spent trying to teach foreigners how to fill out grant applications to get more welfare from the U.S. $300,000 to help Brazilians get off Brazilian welfare. $500,000 spent jump-starting the Haitian film industry. There are billions of dollars that we can spend on the southern border, but we should take it from somewhere and not add it to the debt of our kids and our grandkids.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Carolina.
Mr. President, I'm going to move to table this amendment. Being the chairman of the Foreign Ops Subcommittee, this is taking one disaster and creating 100 in its place. This $4.6 billion will destroy all the humanitarian assistance we passed to deal with an unprecedented wave of refugees. The global health programs are all impacted severely. PEDFAR, the Child Survival and Maternal Health Programs, this money comes out of those accounts. Can you imagine how it's going to be to deal with Ebola after cutting the global health program? Programs to counter the influence of Russia and China will be zeroed out. Counter human trafficking programs will be dramatically reduced. Counterterrorism programs are all affected by this amendment. You're taking one problem at the border, and if you enact the Paul Amendment, you're going to create 100 in its place. So I move to table the Paul Amendment number 902 and ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the remaining votes in this series be 10 minutes in length.
5 minutes. Is there objection? 5 minutes. Without objection. The clerk will call the roll on the motion to table.
Mr. Alexander. Okay. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito. Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Cassidy, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Kramer, Daines, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gardner, Hassan, Heinrich, Hirono, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson, Jones, King, Leahy, Markey, McConnell, McSally, Menendez, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Peters, Portman, Reed, Risch, Roberts, Romney, Rosen, Rubio, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Shelby, Cinema, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Thune, Van Hollen, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Graham, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Blackburn, Enzi, Grassley, Kennedy, Lankford, Paul, Perdue, and Toomey. Mr. Manchin, aye. Ms. Ernst, no. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Tillis, no. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Udall, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, no. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye.
Or to change their vote? If not, the yeas are 77, the nays are 15. The motion to proceed is agreed to. Motion to table is agreed to. Question is on Amendment 901. The yeas and nays were previously ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Barrasso, Blackburn, Blumenthal, Blunt, Brown, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Cassidy, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Duckworth, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hassan, Hawley, Heinrich, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson, Jones, Kennedy, King, Langford, Manchin, McSally, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Peters, Reed, Risch, Romney, Rosen, Rubio, Sass, Schumer, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shaheen, Smith, Stabenow, Sullivan, Tester, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Whitehouse, and Wicker. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Braun, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Ms. Sinema, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Hirono, Lee, Markey, Merkley, and Paul. Mr. Menendez, no. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Purdue, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Coons, aye.
This is going to.
Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Udall, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. McConnell, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 84 and the nays are 8. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is agreed to. The clerk will read the bill for the third time.
H.R. 3401, an act making emergency supplemental appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2019, and for other purposes.
Is there sufficient second? There appears to be. There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Ms. Rosen, Cortez Master. Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, not on this. Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar. Thank you. Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Cinema, Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Barrasso, Blackburn, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Braun, Capito, Casey, Cassidy, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Kramer, Crapo, Daines, Enzi, Feinstein, Gardner, Graham, Hassan, Hawley, Heinrich, Hoven, Isaacson, Johnson, Jones, Kane, Kennedy, King, Langford, Leahy, Manchin, McConnell, McSally, Moran, Murphy, Murray, Perdue, Portman, Peters, Portman, Reed, Roberts, Romney, Rosen, Rubio, Schatz, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Stabenow, Sullivan, Tester, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Warner, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Hirono, Markey, Menendez, and Paul. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mrs. Hyde Smith, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher? Aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe? Aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley? Aye. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst? Aye. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander? Aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin? Aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall? Aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz? Aye. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 84 and the nays are 8. The 60-vote threshold having been achieved, the bill, as amended, is passed.
I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding Rule 22, the cloture motions filed on Senate Amendment numbers 764 and S-1790 are at a time to be determined by the Majority Leader in consultation with the Democratic Leader.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, I'm glad that the bipartisan Senate border supplemental is passed with an overwhelming vote. I commend Chairman Shelby, Senator Leahy, and the members of the Appropriations Committee for breaking the logjam. On NDAA, the Democratic leader and I have had extensive discussions on the path forward on the defense bill. So, for the information of all of our colleagues, we intend to stay in session this week to finish the NDAA bill and allow for a vote in relation to the Udall amendment. Senators should plan to vote on Friday on the Udall amendment, but the vote, here's the good news, the vote will start first thing in the morning and be held open into the afternoon to accommodate as many senators as possible. So to be clear, obviously I believe the Udall amendment can and should be defeated, I hope with a resounding vote in the Senate, and we should put this issue to rest before we break for the 4th of July recess. Holding up the defense authorization bill is not an acceptable outcome.
Mr. President.
Democratic leader.
Well, first, I want to thank the Majority Leader for understanding how strongly we feel on the Democratic side, and many Americans feel, that the constitutional right of Congress to examine foreign conflict and potential war be upheld. The fact that we will get a vote on the Udall Amendment, something we have asked for, is only fair and only right. There may be differences of viewpoint between both sides, but the fact that it will be on the floor and be debated is exactly the right thing to do, something we want and have asked for, and I thank the Majority Leader for understanding that and allowing that to happen.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.